recover their land, compelling their descendants to reside in a placeless state of exile. Reparations for this genocide are impossible to calculate at this time, but the moment that we take for a land acknowledgement is, I think, especially fitting this afternoon. In the case of Brooklyn, this means that the land of the Lenape, the word Lenape means people, was colonized by settlers with enslaved people who were forcibly removed from Africa, resulting in, by my thinking, a layered red and black genocide that seems even more difficult to calculate. What are we to do with this memory? How are we to assume responsibility for the privilege the Pratt Institute affords us as students and faculty members to gather in a place that is haunted like this? As an Oglala Lakota Sundance person, I offer Mitakie Yawasin, a Lakota affirmation of the interconnectedness and mutual interdependency of creation. Everything is related. The principle of interconnectedness and mutual interdependency of creation is at the foundation of the In Search of African and Indigenous Space Research Collective, a world-making and shaping operation that foregrounds the transformative development of spatial practices among African American and Indigenous people in the wake of state and extra-state oppression. As we know, Indigenous people assisted African slaves in their search for freedom in the Western Hemisphere, in what's become an ongoing reciprocal relationship. We come here today in Black History Month to celebrate the pursuit of freedom that is the ongoing challenge of all people of color. Freedom is a constant struggle, as Angela Davis has recently said, both for Black and Indigenous peoples. Due to the ontological rupture, African slavery is a special category. As a descendant of Shawnee people, of abolitionists and civil rights activists, I believe, like John Brown, that we are all bound to the horrible condition of slavery, which can only be ameliorated through radical collective action. In the spirit of radical collective action, we'd like to thank the many people who have contributed to the teach-in today, especially as we put it together in such short notice. We were hoping to present, as we were talking earlier, at Black Lives Matter, but then we learned that Black Lives Matter has become inactive. So we rushed this into place fairly quickly. We'd like to especially thank Dean Harriet Harris, Assistant Dean Killian Riano, and Professor Courtney Knapp in the Dean's Office of the School of Architecture for their generous support. The student presenters whose work has been informed by their involvement in African American Indigenous space inside and outside of the curriculum. The presenters have framed their talks at 5 minutes to briefly introduce the project and focus specifically on the topic of situated, embodied, lived experience. Situated, embodied, lived experience can refer to their own personal experience in designing the project, such as a personal history and or engagement with that history, or an approach they adapted to imagine scenarios for the occupants of their architecture in a cultural context. By situated, we mean that it's sited in a real experience in a place. By embodied, we mean that it's felt deeply as an experience that registered on many levels of the body and mind. And by lived, we mean that it is a reference that you can draw from as a person who lives in the African diaspora. The students are in order of their appearance and class ranking as follows: Sydney King, Cameron Clark, Jared Rice, Baron Syracuse, Cameron Clark, Sierra Francelone, and CJ Spring, representing the class of 22, and Joshua Cooper and Onye Agochu, respectively, from the class of 20 and 21. Our gratitude extends also to tonight's respondents, Alicia Imperial and Jonah Rowan from the Architecture History faculty, and Caitlin Cahill and Ann Holder from Social Science and Cultural Studies Department. We have all agreed to come here today to engage in a discussion of embodied, situated, lived experience in relationship to architecture, a topic that often exists outside of the discourse of the formalist studio. We selected the term teach-in to indicate an assembly that looks to gather and share knowledge from outside of academic discourse, such as the historic teach-ins by the Afro-American Association at UC Berkeley in the 1960s that predated the formation of the Black Panther Party and the introductions of a Black Studies curriculum. Before I turn the mic over to Scott Ruff, I'd like to cite a passage in conclusion that I think speaks particularly to the ambition of today's event. It's from Dion Brand's A Map to the Door of No Return. To live in the African diaspora is, I think, to live in a fiction, a creation of empires and also self-creation. It is to be living inside and outside of herself. It is to apprehend the sign one makes, yet to be unable to escape it, except in radiant moments of ordinariness made like art. Thank you.
Yes, good afternoon. I am Scott Ruff, Adjunct Associate Professor of Architecture and co-founder of In Search of African American and Indigenous Space Research Consortium, and co-editor of In Search of African American Space, Redressing Racism. My experience with embodied and situated lived experience is my life growing up in Buffalo, New York, on the East Side, predominantly African American community, and attending Cornell University as an HEOP student, which really means that I was a student that was considered to come from an area and a community that was disenfranchised economically and possibly even educationally. And so I came in through that state program and found my own experiences at Cornell to be challenging, to put it politely. Didn't necessarily have an easy time going through the curriculum as it was set up. And sometime during that process, I had a revelation or a series of revelations just through talks with teachers, mentors, things of that nature, that made me think that I could do it better, that I could teach what they were doing and communicate it better than they could. Also, that there was a lot of information that they weren't necessarily teaching me that I felt needed to also be communicated. And so that all led to becoming a professor of architecture, and to courses such as some of the courses that are going to be presented here, work with students through student organizations that is also presented here, not in the foreground, but I would say in a subtext of this set of presenters. There is a kind of organization, not even kind of, there is NOMAS. I think most of the students do belong to the organization, but also more importantly, a sense of developing cohorts for learning. And so again, that's part of my lived experience. More to the students. The students will be talking tonight about how they feel and think about the work they are doing in the areas of culture and social justice. As a faculty advisor to NOMAS, the National Organization of Minority Architecture Students, I learned about many of these issues from the students who are going to present today. Today's event is organized in the following manner. The first two students will present maps that they created in the elective class that we co-taught, Jeffrey and myself co-taught last fall, Mapping Lines of Flight. The premise of the course is that the map is an inherently colonial project. Each student selected an area that they were familiar with and over the course of the semester wrote themselves into the area and a new map through a series of exercises. These two particular students, Sydney King and Cameron Clark, decolonized the map with deeply personal accounts of their families' Afro-descended histories in the areas of their mapping. They looked at the map in terms of atmosphere, topology, and cultural formations and layers. After Sydney and Cameron, Jared Rice will present the research that he conducted as a research assistant in the Pratt Weeksville Archive, a collaboration of Pratt Institute and Weeksville Heritage Center. The archive was born out of our work on In Search of African American Space. Weeksville was the second largest African American enclave in the US before it was absorbed by the forces of anti-Black racism that informed real estate development in New York City. The Weeksville Heritage Center has opened the archive to support neighborhood growth that aims to locate a more equitable relationship between gender, race, and class in community development. The next two groups of presenters, Baron Syracuse and Cameron Clark, and Sierra Francelone and CJ Spring, will represent projects that they developed in a fourth-year research studio that we taught entitled Connecting to the Archive. We looked to locate ways to reconnect to the archive of the Pratt Weeksville Heritage Center and of Central Brooklyn at large. Central Brooklyn is the largest Afro-descendant community in the US, with a constantly shifting and shrinking population due to the forces of anti-Black racism and, again, real estate development of New York City. Their projects looked to Afro-surrealism for an alternate present and the operation of the rhizome to create a relationship with a Pan-Africa in the past, present, and future. The final two presenters, Joshua Cooper and Oni Egochu, will present degree projects that each, from different perspectives with different methodologies, address the theme of embodied, situated, lived experience in radically transformative ways for the teaching and practice of architecture in the African diaspora. Their projects are evidence of the support that the Research for African American and Indigenous Space has brought to the School of Architecture, and of the value of the NOMAS chapter that Oni co-founded and served as president in their senior year. Help me to welcome the first two presenters. So, Sydney King and Cameron Clark.
Hey y'all, so let me go ahead and share my screen. I'll make this kind of quick. And so the elective that we were in was called Mapping Lines of Flight. And so this is kind of my lines. What you see to the left is a very work in progress when we were talking about the mythiopoetic as well as typography as afro art as well as atmosphere, kind of understanding my place. And my place is that I'm from Hampton, Virginia. Hampton, Newport News, Virginia is kind of known as Hampton Roads. It includes the whole coast. If you know Jamestown, which a lot of US history starts where everyone landed, as well as the surrounding when it comes to Williamsburg, Portsmouth, Yorktown, all those battles. And so to show this, I am showing that where I am from, it happens to be a central place of violence that you don't really normally realize that you're around unless you kind of go outside of it and grow into it. And so growing up, it's gonna sound funny. I have been to these plantations, I have been to cotton fields, but it wasn't something that, especially as a young African-American, kind of growing up in a central place of where people landed, as well as heavily occupied by military, the US military. We have all the bases. We have naval bases as well as a joint base with Marines. We have the Air Force as well as the Army. And so we are also part of the strategic war points from the beginning and how we were mapped from the beginning as a type of port and transportation. And so I begin to actually look at the shallowness of the water, the shore between the land, when some of us first came here, as well as Indigenous Africans and the intersection of Indigenous Americans, and how that intersection really began to localize itself over the years, and how you don't even realize as a local, you're moving through this type of in-between space, this shore that is slowly eroding over the years as somebody who is in this misty environment. And so this is a map. Oh, I can't see it. From 1853, it's an old nautical chart with typography and hydrology. It's kind of showing where our waters meet, because we are at the intersection of the James River, the Chesapeake Bay, and then the open of the Atlantic Ocean. We also have brackish water, fresh water, salty waters. And so we also have a lot of marshes, a lot of these shores that have been cultivated for, of course, different, obviously ports. We have shipyards, as well as fishing. And so fishing happens to be a big part of where a lot of the labor for us came from. And so when it came to oyster shucking, as well as, you know, shrimps, crabs, and everything, that became kind of the culture of when it came to eating. And so kind of thinking through how I guess I felt in my place after kind of being an outsider and then coming back from being in school and constantly coming back and seeing the shifts I've noticed. They introduced us to this book by Tiffany Lethable King called The Black Shoals, Offshore Formations of Black and Native Studies, which really began to solidify how I projected myself and my surrounding, and things that I took from it that I felt was very like speculative when it came to projecting, as well as representative, and not just when you think of the map, you see symbols that are, you know, they're occupied actually by humans as well as non-humans. And so kind of understanding that the two, when even with the two indigenous bodies, it's like of cosmology and like a linguistic system, as well as the streams were prominent, as well as when it came to messages being carried from each other. And so I began to, this is like one of the still work in progress, but I began to only map the water because the water happens to be, when it comes to like flooding, occupation, our proximity to what we eat, everything seems to go back to this shoreline, this depth. And so we began to extract when it comes to evacuation routes, when it comes to how we begin to walk around our shores, the shallowness, when it comes to our ecology, it's a lot of marshiness, it's a lot of this lushness that we seem to have like adapted to in a way that is almost normal. So some of us begin to like, we have these worries, of course, of flooding, but at the same time, we understand the life that our surrounding gives us through this, this drowning almost, that is also kind of a lingering worry when it comes to, especially over the years with the occupation of military and slowly, you know, climate change and sinking. Kind of just extracting when mapping, we always tend to map land and how it's such a hard line, when reality, when it comes to people on the coast, is this smoothness, this transition, is this also this fear we talked about. And then as well as when it comes to nighttime, so that, you know, that could be daytime when it's tidal, but when it comes to nighttime, you know, we understand the moon patterns, you know, astrology, you know, the tides, the waves, how you understand the messages you carry when they're high tide versus low tide, versus if you know there's going to be water spout, understanding danger, understanding how to even navigate through each other. There are old stories of, you know, enslaved peoples traveling by water at night through the stars. And so that's a type of cosmology as well when it came to people in safety. Safety within the depth, safety within these waves that would come, safety within themselves, and understanding through the intersection of Indigenous Americans as well as Africans and their understanding of each other and how they moved through and helped each other. And then the last one I kind of threw in because it was more so mythopoetic. I felt when it came to understanding the violence of these occupations, of these huge aircrafts, of the, you know, Thomas Jefferson, of their buildings and the type of structures that are built upon these lands that are so very like kind of desacred because it's next to these very high violent occupations that still live through today. We have many forts and plantations and everything. And so kind of understanding what happens when that drowns out, this like, again, that lingering dooms, that fear, when in reality is this, it ends up being something more like beautiful in the end. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Yes, Cameron.
Okay, yeah. Let me share my screen. Should I make this? I'm gonna try and make this larger real quick. That didn't work. Okay, so my project is, this is the end. This is sort of through my dad's eyes. And he's from Minneapolis, Minnesota. We had recently visited there, and we had kind of, while we were there, we talked about all of these things that had changed and looking into the history of where he's from and things like that. So that's kind of what this is about. How do I make this bigger? Okay, I don't know. I'm gonna start if I can. Okay. All right. So let me get into my introduction. My dad was born in Minneapolis, Minnesota in 1962 to a white mother and a black father. His mother and father were not married. As a matter of fact, his mother was married to a white man with whom she had multiple children. So when my father was born, his mother kept him, hoping that he was the son of her husband. Once his pigment and his hair started to come in, and they realized that my dad was black, they sent him off to an orphanage in order to save their marriage. In 1966, my dad was adopted by a white family that already had 4 children of their own. He grew up in a suburb of Minneapolis, mostly disconnected from Black culture. He was regularly the only, or one of 2 Black people in his middle schools and high schools, kind of growing up in a white world with a white family. My project is about that Twin Cities Black culture that he wasn't really able to be a part of while he was growing up, but what he and I reflect on now as we look back and try and learn about his heritage. It's also about the Black community of Minneapolis and St. Paul and how it's morphed and changed in the years since he left, and his and my reaction to it coming back. So just to explain this like overall map a little bit, and then I'll get into certain areas of it, zoom-ins of it. This up here on the the northwest of this map, kind of where this jumble of redlining and this yellow dot is, that's Minneapolis. And then over to the east on the south, where the, you can tell because there's another jumble of redlining, that's where St. Paul is. So Minneapolis and St. Paul was kind of a sort of a destination for Black people during the Great Migration. Black people coming up from kind of the middle of the country, from Texas and Arkansas, would come north. Many of them would stop in Chicago, but some of them would keep going, and they would find themselves way up here in Minnesota. So the first thing I want to talk about is Rondo. This was a neighborhood that was home of 80% of African Americans in St. Paul before the government decided to put the I-94 highway running right through the neighborhood. So this was kind of a Black hub. 1 in 8 Black people in St. Paul, the whole city, lost their homes in this neighborhood due to I-94. And this happened in 1956, from 1956 to 1968. So kind of in the early years of my dad's life. This still houses some of the bigger communities, Black communities in the Twin Cities. But of course, the community is kind of divided now, and it's not as much as a hub as it used to be. In Southside, Minneapolis, we have the same thing that happened. This used to be like the main, cultural hub of Minneapolis following the Great Migration. And then once again, the I-39 West was constructed in 1959 and ran through this neighborhood. Once again, the effects were being felt as my dad was like being born and was a young child. In the 80s, the crack epidemic hit, and public schools were closed, and students were bused elsewhere. And the neighborhood, the Black population has remained, but the neighborhood isn't the hub that it once was. Recently, this was the spot where George Floyd was murdered. On that corner, it was down in this neighborhood, and the memorial is here. And so that's kind of what the current legacy of this neighborhood. Prince and Prince's music was kind of a way that my father was able to connect to the city and the Black population of the city. To this day, he listens to a lot of white music because of his ring, what his parents and his siblings would listen to. But Prince was always somebody who he felt very connected to, and to this day, Prince is kind of the icon for in the face of the Twin Cities. We were at a baseball game. And it was the Twins versus Milwaukee or whatever. And people would be wearing Purple Rain shirts, and that's kind of the
Did he freeze?
there over the summer. My grandparents lived up here in in kind of the center of Minneapolis. And what we notice is there are all these like recent like East African immigrants, especially from Somalia. And so we were there and we were thinking like my dad was, you know, he left the city, he moved to Chicago and then he moved to California and he had me, and now he comes back every now and then to see his family. And what's kind of happened is, you know, we go into the city center and he sees all of these new, you know, Black people, Black faces who were never kind of around in the center of Minneapolis before. You know, the Black population has kind of exploded, and it's because there are all these, you know, Somali and East African immigrants that are coming over, and, you know, Minneapolis has become like a hub for, you know, Somalis especially. It's like the biggest Somali population outside of like Somalia in the world, I think. And so that's kind of something that's changed as well. And he doesn't recognize, and that's something that's new. And then this is something else that I wanted to talk about. This is a kind of recent study that was done. The red is areas where they interviewed like, you know, 1,000 or so like Black people living in Minneapolis and St. Paul, you know, whether they were recent immigrants or Black people whose families have been here. And these are the areas where Black people would want to live. So they asked them, where would you feel comfortable living? And so you kind of have like, you know, the reddest parts are the, you know, areas where people want to live. And those also coincide with where Black populations are. So there's a little bit in the suburbs, but, you know, what happens is that people want to live, you know, near each other. Whether it's Black populations that have been here since the 30s, 40s, and 50s, or whether it's, you know, new immigrants that are coming in. They, you know, they live among who is also like them, and so that's something that we had talked about too, revisiting Minnesota. And so coming back, overall, this was kind of a, it was something that he and I we thought of a little bit in, you know, as we came back and visited, you know, when I was growing up, but it's something to really see, you know, as he's gotten older, especially, he's become more and more interested in his past and the heritage of like his father, who, you know, he never knew, but he wants to learn more about you know, Black people and who he came from in Minneapolis. And so this is kind of what he and I have learned about the history of, you know, the African American population coming from the South through the Great Migration up to Minneapolis and St. Paul, and the new Black population, which comes from East Africa. Yeah, and that's sort of what I did for my mapping.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Cameron.
And, so next we will have Jared Rice, who will present.
Okay, let me share my screen. My Wi-Fi has been a bit spotty, so I'm probably going to turn on my camera off just to make sure. Yeah, so let me view slideshow, pull up the script. Can you guys see everything? Cool. All right. So, hey y'all. My name is Jared, and I'm going to be speaking about the Weeksville Archive and its broader implications on my life and applications. So some background, we just went over this a little bit, but to recap, It was founded in 1838 by formerly enslaved persons and freedmen. The goal was to create a self-sustaining community in Brooklyn, and it was successful. It was the second largest Black self-sustaining community. And then from the 20th century on, we've really seen a lot of different ways of structural violences towards Weeksville. We're doing things of discrimination, erasure, disinvestment, and all things of the sort. So with our project, we sought to really explore the potentials of counteracting this gentrification and structural violences through celebration and documentation of the history and cultural assets of the area, as well.
I don't know if you can hear us, Jared. We lost your audio.
Came to actual.
He's coming back now.
Can you hear me?
Yeah,
Now we do.
we do. We hear you now. Yeah.
Yeah, so I don't know where I cut out, but here the target of the project was to document highlight, celebrate the histories, construct a network between people who are living there currently, and different practices and places that are around, and then creating a self-sustainable precedent for futures, creating an archive where people can go and look and learn, as Scott mentioned earlier. So some of the early maps we were making were starting to get at this point. We looked at churches, religious spaces, elderly homes, delis, barbershops, and salons, among other things, to try and find places of cultural hubs that we can speak to. Then on the right, we also looked at maps of building age and history, trying to see what's been in the area. We also looked at the Hunterfly Road, which ran through and was disrupted by the grid that was placed over it. In addition to this, we also see the grid that's been shifted. And so it's this looking at history and seeing, okay, maybe through doing this, we can start to know what buildings are old, what buildings have a history that we can start to ask and guide our question through. So we looked at a lot of these different sites. We went forward with the Bethel Tabernacle AME Church as the first space to investigate, and I'll talk about that in a second. But we were also looking at the bas-relief that's on one of the housing projects in the area. We went and visited the site, and that picture at the bottom right is actually from the summer after I really concluded my work on here. But during the process, I was in Houston during COVID. And while I was in Houston, I was facing another issue during the second semester that helped broaden my understanding and importance of our work. So we had the freeze. I don't know if you remember, about a year ago now, we had a big freeze that we had rolling blackouts, and these were distributed unequally. A lot of the poorer areas had much longer blackouts. Some, like, I had a friend that was in a very rich area and he never lost power. It's a very unequal distribution, although they're saying it's equal. Sorry, I lost my space. So we had unequal distribution of these blackouts. And many people had a lack of access to things like food, water, heat, and other resources. So I saw with our community band together like I've never seen before, and started addressing these needs towards self-sufficiency, since our government wasn't providing any aid. I used what I knew I could do and started mapping out areas of community fridges, spaces where people were distributing free water. So people would just stand at the corner of some streets and start handing out water bottles and such. And so I started mapping out these areas. I started creating or consolidating and passing out some resources for fixing pipes that were bursting because all of them were frozen. And really our community came together in the our community coming together in the natural disaster was the only thing that really helped us pursue through the freeze. And so this really showed me how the importance of this mutual aid network, this self-sustaining communities, it showed me how these are important because at any instant, it can be what is holding us and surviving, helping us survive. And then after the freeze, at the bottom right, I worked on some Black-owned businesses in the area and helped us see if we can sustain that way and start to learn where they are around because they're quite scattered. But within the project, going forward past the mapping portion, we got to, or the initial mapping portion, we got to our first interview. This screenshot is a bit blurry, but it was with Ronald Johnson, speaking of a church. And it also starts to show how we can how these interviews branch out and create networks. From that interview, we saw different families, different family networks, how they work together, different people that we could talk to. We learned a lot about the area just from one person, people who we should contact more to learn more. So these different things. As far as questions, the foundations of our interviews lie in allowing people to speak as they want and how they want. And then more specifically, we curate the questions to start on a topic, but our goal is to speak about what they want, what shaped them to get to that point, and how that guides them going forward. These questions center firstly on expanding on facts about their life, to expound on the experiences that they have. But then we ask facts about the area, about the community, to allow them to contextualize, allow them to redefine, to have the narrative as they see it rather than what we can find in Google, find on these spaces, to really create that archive that way. And the goal of this is to have conversations that grow. We're trying to have somewhat of streams of consciousness where people are bringing up things themselves to where we are only giving prompts and they're providing us with the substance. Also, we wanted to create a questioning of mutual exchange and flipping the script. Jeffrey was very good in bringing this up to where we have they can ask questions to us and we can share common experiences. With that, me relating with Ronald on sort of some rituals going to church brought about a whole new conversation that then shaped us for later interviews. So this kind of mutual interchange was imperative. So finally concluding, in constructing the archive, this proved one of the most interesting parts for me, where archives help us uncover the histories and knowledge just passed down that many of us haven't been able to access because a lot of times people try to erase them. It can be hard for many of us to know our histories, know our past, and the ways in which we can go forward. Archives, however, can be the site of exclusions and categorizations as well. When projects are done top-down and sifted through as such, it can frame them through whatever lens the creator wants. So to avoid this relation, despite the need to write descriptions and tags or hashtags for each of the interviews, I sought to find a through line and themes. How I went about doing this was that I went through connecting the tangents from the interview process. I focused on information that people were bringing up on their own, showing unprovoked thoughts, unprompted thoughts. And these were the areas where we thought they were bringing the most forward from themselves. And then seeing where multiple people could bring forward the same thing, could start to show through lines of community thought, through lines of how people relate to their communities, and maybe give us themes of which we can look forward to and or go forward with. And similar to how we were talking about earlier, how this was aimed at counter gentrification topics, these can be spaces of cultural assets and such that we can work through. And then also just a note, we also wanted to note the differences in the individual moments due to maybe personal reasons or personal things, as this starts to point towards deeper resonations with the surrounding community. And then finally, how I manifest this in my work going forward, because I finished this last year. I've grown to use a lot of these ideas in much of what I do. And really what I'm focused on right now is Pratt Futures and trying to create somewhat of an archive through that sense. I take a lot of the question methods that I've learned from this and curate questions to try and pull identity through. I also hope that the events with multiple speakers can start to become information archives that we can all use going forward. So like the event on the left, but then the resource document on the right, pooling together a ton of readings, videos, different things you can learn about these topics. And hopefully this becomes a somewhat kind of new archive. And so this is like an event that's coming next week about Black communal care, hopefully tackling these topics. But yeah, so this is how it sort of resonated with me going forward. Yeah. And I guess I can drop a link to that later. I don't want to overshadow anyone now, but yeah, thank you.
Right, and thank you. And please drop a link in the chat now, if you can. We have our next presenters. These presenters will be team presenters. Baron Syracuse and Cameron Clark will be first, and then Sierra Francelon and CJ Spring will be after that grouping. All right, the show is yours.
Oops. Let me share my screen. Okay, hello, and this is Transhistoric Surrealism. Our site is situated in Crown Heights, where we focus our research on the former site of Ebbets Field Stadium, where Jackie Robinson broke baseball's color barrier. As the site of integration of baseball in the US, Ebbets Field is a significant African-American space that was erased and replaced by a monstrous apartment tower that introduces Coursera logic for public housing of African-American people. This project imagines an alternative reality where Ebbets Field apartments never existed by appropriating the space that was taken away from the Black community and reclaiming history that has been buried. The framework of the housing that took the place of Ebbets Field is reimagined in a way that restores the memory of Crown Heights, where Black life was celebrated by the introduction of Black baseball player and Black audience in a previously white institution.
We made use of collages to organize our research of Crown Heights and the Black community present there. Our project reimagines the possibilities for residents who are rehoused in a structure that supports their interests and abilities by highlighting the role of agriculture in the history of Brooklyn and the African diaspora. In our process, I thought of the food that I had grown up eating at family gatherings, after church, on holidays, et cetera, as inspiration. And we took these type of foods and these crops needed to create them. And we used those crops as references to inform the structure and geometries that are on the site. Through our research, we found a lot of local community projects that we would serve as a base, and they can come to us to gather resources and educate the community with their projects and research with practices like food justice programs and food education.
For our design, we imagined the community engaging and celebrating in the history of the site. We wanted to emulate the presence of Ebbets Field by mimicking the original archways that once lived on the site. By opening up the ground floor, the community can circulate around the site from neighboring streets, and that connects the site to the people.
We also felt that the representation of the community was really important to show in these renders. Architectural renders, both as they are done in real life and in school, are often kind of devoid of life. So we wanted to, we felt the renders are typically whitewashed, and we thought it was important to represent the Black community in Crown Heights through our perspectives. We were inspired by Afro-Surrealism and wanted to incorporate elements of our collages into these views. Through growing, making, selling, cooking, and cultivating, the center reclaims Ebbets Field and brings the community back together with architectural practices that celebrate African history.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Right, thank you very much. Sierra and CJ.
I'm going to share my screen.
Can everyone hear me? Okay, cool. So from the start, being able to focus on Central Brooklyn as a site was really exciting for us. Both of our families grew up in Central Brooklyn, so we saw this as an opportunity to learn more about its history, seeing it as a way to understand the lives our family members lived. When we were given Brownsville as our place of study, I was definitely personally invested, as my father grew up in the Ocean Hill, Brownsville area for a decent part of his younger years. And I saw this as an opportunity to get some background to how it was during his time there.
Collage became very important in how we were able to visualize and understand the histories of Brownsville. The collages allowed us a creative, free, and flexible way to explore the historical context of these neighborhoods, the social issues that needed to be resolved, and the joys of the neighborhoods, the identity of these neighborhoods. Through our research and through our medium of collage, we saw that Brownsville suffers from the lasting and continuing traumas of the carceral system, a system designed to prey on Black Americans, criminalizing poverty with the goals of turning our communities into inmate factories, leaving deep generational wounds that have seldom been addressed.
By doing these collages, we also understood that these community gardens in Brownsville are super important to the community. We really found these community gardens incredibly fascinating, and we're interested in how these community gardens offer some relief for the residents of Brownsville from the systemic struggles of their day-to-day.
Given that Brownsville, in the context of greater New York City, is a site of mass incarceration, but also a site of community activism through agricultural means, by turning abandoned lots into community gardens, that led us to using Angela Davis's anti-carceral essays as an identifier of the historical problem of over-policing in Brownsville, and utilizing Tuskegee University as almost a programmatic precedent as we seek to make architecture that houses agricultural program as a method of self-sufficiency. The Gardens of the Dispossessed and Plantation Futures to activate this agriculture as not only a self-sufficiency, but self-sufficiency as a move of rebellion and resistance against the carceral system. Through hybridizing these sources, the project seeks to reverse the school-to-prison pipeline through reparations in the form of agricultural education and cultivation to return the commons to the Black community.
Ultimately, the goal is to set up a series of rhizomatic structures that partner with the existing context to create a campus that encourages a self-sufficient community through agricultural means, upending the white supremacist framing of Black agriculture in the context of chattel slavery and using agriculture as a form of resistance, a way of combating the carceral system.
Designing like this and working on a project like this stress the importance of truly crafting and designing spaces for people, using architecture as a vessel for change rather than simply the solution or savior of a community.
Between becoming immersed in the text of radical Black figures, studying radical Black space, and really questioning the systems that allow Black communities to remain disenfranchised, this allowed us the ability to really consider possible solutions that would give power to the people to safeguard their communities from forces like gentrification and conditions that make our neighborhoods targets for state violence. This project left us invested in the possibilities of using architecture as a vessel to be used by the people to achieve radical change.
All right, thank you very much for both of those presentations. We move into our alum, and And our first presenter is Joshua Cooper. Hey, Josh.
Hi, let me share my screen. Oh, I forgot how to do this.
Do you have it? It's at the bottom of the screen, a green button. Share screen.
Yeah, I do. I just I'm on a different computer, so.
Oh, okay.
Here we go. Don't get a MacBook. It's worse. Actually, it's because of the security issue, so I have to leave this and come back. So I'm sorry.
Okay.
That's okay. Take your time.
Yeah, sorry about that. Let me come back.
Well, this is a good kind of anti-commercial. Don't get a MacBook, get a PC and use Androids. All right, enough of the commercial break. We'll give him a few more, another minute or two to come in. We may shift to Onyi in a moment. We see your screen. And can you hear us? We can't hear you. Is your mic on? We can't, turn your mic on.
Sorry about that. Can you see the screen? Is it full screen?
Full screen, full steam ahead, you're
Okay.
good.
Okay, sweet. First, I wanted to talk about the film that was paired with this project. VM1 was a found footage docu-narrative that depicted the Black experience. It was inspired by actual mixtapes that, mixtapes that were back in 07, where it was just the rawest form of the music. So everything was kind of categorized as tracks. And these tracks were inspired by either personal experience or conversations that I had with mentors, family members, anybody who was just interested in the project. A couple of them in particular, I mentioned one, which was at a pinup where Scott Ruff told me to look at the project, not in a surface level way, but look at it more layered. There's a lot of layers that come with the stuff that I was talking about. And another one was experience that my father actually had. I would talk about the Detroit riots because he played a huge role in the cultural shift in the city. And he explained that it's a short story, but he was explaining to me or telling me about how my grandfather, which I didn't really know him, his father, he stayed on the porch with a shotgun because he didn't know, the riots were the park where the riots started was right next to his house, so he didn't know if somebody was going to kick in the door or whatever, during the chaos. It was also the visual mixtape was also inspired by, and the project was inspired by both, what I was personally going through in a sense of creatively, and also the music I was listening to. I was listening to a lot of Damn by Kendrick Lamar. I was listening to Pimp a Butterfly, which inspired a lot of the titles for the drawings And so did Solange's A Seat at the Table, which is a fantastic album. Any of you haven't heard it yet. And then creatively, I just felt I was frustrated with the curriculum at Pratt when it came to the programs that we were doing. It's like in 3rd and 4th year. I was really uninspired. This was off the heels of like making a dorm for a PWI, and then making a boat house for Columbia, and then 4th year was doing group projects where it wasn't like a group where it's like another person, it was like the whole studio. So I was just really, really disinterested, and really questioning if I wanted to be an architect, which led to this project was during that time was like, I was kind of like slowly doing the concept and ideas in my 3rd year. And so, yeah, then this kind of led up to that. Oh, and also the conversations that I had with a lot of my professors during the time who were in this studio, it kind of just changed my perspective on how to approach this project. Instead of looking at it in an architectural way, you should look at it as more as a human experience as a whole. And so that kind of helped with the mixtape as well. Instead of, you know, just me spewing things at you, why don't I just tell you about experiences or conversations that kind of influenced all of this stuff that happened. So that leads into the carcass, which is my site. And it started with concept art. And this is called When Aliens Invade. It is a response to gentrification that exists to displace minorities in their communities. The conceptual piece depicts the Farnsworth House, one of the most famous pieces of modern architecture left abandoned and consumed by vegetation. This highlighted the idea of using natural technologies to craft a space for people, for the very people that modernism is trying to displace. And yeah, this was just me being angry because I just really hated, you know, during the time I lived in Brooklyn and then also in Detroit, there's a lot of changes when it comes to the city of Detroit. Like downtown doesn't even look the same anymore. It's not really meant for people who look like me. So this was just a response of like, okay, well, if you're going to change my neighborhood, let me change something that you guys cherish, which was the Farnsworth House. And these kind of discoveries led to me going back and going back to my site in Detroit. And so those concepts led to the idea of crafting crafting space on an abandoned site in the city of Detroit, a city that's plagued with abandonment and racial inequality. Since Detroit is deemed the Motor City, the Packers plant site underlined the importance of the automotive industry and Detroit culture, while also showcasing the outcome of abandonment that not only infests the site, but the surrounding neighborhood that at one point was a part of red line communities that plagued the city, which ignited the riots in the early and late 60s, because there were 2 riots. And so, so these are the other areas around the site. And right after the 60s, the 90s, and during the 80s and 90s, there were a bunch of raves that happened in the Packer plant. And a lot of that has to do with Detroit techno being being popularized. Techno in general, it wasn't invented yet until like somebody, Black DJs in Detroit kind of discovered it. And they basically crafted the sound to be paired with the actual of how the actual site of how Detroit looks. So like Detroit was starting to get abandoned during that time. I mean, this Packer plant was left abandoned, or it started to be abandoned in like the 60s. So this was just they wanted something to kind of be paired with that. So they created the sound of Detroit techno, which is like they also like the concept of Afrofuturism because there was a lot of funk that was happening during that time. It was like the end of the funk era. And that leads into the soul. From ancient African spiritual practices to personal spiritual enlightenment, during the making of You Will Never Understand, the soul of the project introduced the real ritualistic process of the alienated calling on the exposure of the alien, which is explained as conjuring. This strategy was inspired by the act of praying from Christianity, which plays a pivotal role in Black spirituality and Black mental health. So my idea for conjuring, that was like the word and the concept that we use to kind of take this idea of like putting sugar water so the ants can, dig canals. And we put that as the overall scheme of like when we need to build structure from the ants, or when the ants need to build structure to kind of hold this building up because the building is starting to dilapidate, then we should call it something like conjuring, which is like the definition of it is calling on a spiritual, or calling on a spirit. And what I got from that is kind of like, praying, which is like huge in the Black experience when we talk about, you do it at every meal, you do it at every event. All of my family reunions, before you eat, you pray. So I felt like that was just really important to touch on that and subliminally, capture those moments. And other biblical references cite the Book of Moses and the Book of Joshua and the idea of calling upon spirits. This process of, and I was, this is from a movie that I used to watch when I was a kid, which was The Prince of Egypt. I don't know, for some reason, this scene always was ingrained in my memory or something. And that's kind of what inspired the drawings of like these conjuring drawings and the conjuring maps. And also just my name in general, my name comes from the Bible. When we talk about how deeply rooted, Black, or how deeply rooted spirituality is in, Black history, like my name comes from the Bible. I'm named after he was basically assistant to Moses. So the process of conjuring resulted in the following series of drawings that depicted aliens existing in space. In a more metaphorical aspect, the drawings illustrate spirit or lineage that lingers throughout time, or throughout time and space. And that could mean anything. I kind of left it super ambiguous. It could be ancestors, angels, spiritual protectors. It all depends on, the person. And then these were some other drawings of that. The bones. Resulting from the Untitled series, the Conjuring drawings came the materialized version of lineage, the bones. The bones are created as a structure that not only supports the dilapidated Packer plant, is also used as a structure to encourage growth of vegetation that already exists on the site. So this was from, these are just physical models, but this was finally just taking over the complete site. This is a section of, these like the bones kind of holding this building up. And in the context to the overall theme, the bones are a metaphor to convey that the Black community is the backbone of America. That without a backbone and a soul, America would just be a decaying carcass. Thank you.
Wow.
All right, thank you very much.
Thank you, Josh.
And Oni,
Thank you.
bring us home.
Yeah, 1 second, I'm sorry.
That's all right. Take your time.
Okay. 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 Everyone see my screen?
Yes, we can see it. Thank you.
Okay. So my thesis project last year was titled Seated Junction, Healing for Earth Self. This thesis is an ode to healing for land and all species on Earth, but more of a method of healing for myself too, and all like the junky ways I've navigated the Earth and like my time through Pratt as a student, and the ways that I was told like, oh, you can't do architecture like this, and we need drawings that look like this. And so this was kind of a like my cathartic way of like getting through my last year of grad. So from the doctrine of discovery, the attack on Indigenous lands, exploitation of Black bodies, radicalized police brutality, belligerent theft of Black-owned land, to federal discrimination to all farmers of color, redlining, urban renewal, and mass incarceration, gentrification. Trauma is inherently ingrained in the soil and carried out within our bodies, and the very history of the land on US soil is heavily connected with the pain experienced by marginalized communities of color, especially Black and Indigenous people. For many members from these marginalized communities, taking time to heal from this generational pain, ancestral trauma, and internal trauma is one of the most powerful things we can do with our physical time here on Earth. Healing or self-preservation is an active and revolutionary form of resistance. Seated Junction explores the healing in a playful and insightful manner while providing marginalized communities the ability to reconnect with oneself, nature, food, land, life, and love itself. This project is based in West Oakland, rich in culture, creativity, and playfulness. Historically, the Black people of Oakland have fought against many injustices pertaining to human rights, such as food and land access. And currently, Oakland is one of the largest food deserts in the US. The people suffering from food insecurity are those who live on the flatlands, with the economic divide between the classes being embedded in the geology of the land. When creating this project, I heavily used collage as a method to start envisioning what it would look like. For me, collaging was a design method versus like a finalized render or drawing. Like I worked through many of my thoughts and ways to create this project through storytelling and imagining what it would be like to be these people in these spaces. So for the first activity that we worked on when doing this project was creating an alternative future narrative, in which the depth of world building and self-discovery was influenced by Afrofuturistic artists such as Lacan and Lost in the Island, and used those as a method to assert a new reality grounded in the earth. Ontological belief that the past and present and future are inseparable allows us to live on the earth alongside our past and future selves as we tread. This imaginative framework of psychological liberation has enabled me to conjure this alternative future. And with that, that helped me then move into creating this idea that healing is a continuous spine, and that while healing, we kind of inject these moments of temporal aspects such as like the past, present, future, what is a mix of past and present, and kind of mixing and matching that and shifting and sliding that and still creating healing to be fluid, but knowing that it's not going to be in this linear progressive manner that everyone thinks healing comes. Many times marginalized communities of color are encouraged to assimilate, which is synonymous with the forced onslaught of change, further deepening the diasporic rift between the individual self and historical culture of a community. Often this creates internal dissociation for the individual, adding, erasing, combining, and remixing the many versions of oneself. Our stories and sense of self are never linear and always changing, and this form of alienation or othering creates internal dissociation. There are many births and deaths to the identity of oneself. For me, working on this project, my parents came to the US around the 80s. They're from Nigeria, and so many things that are like culturally important to us kind of got lost when they moved to the South, because my dad went to school in the States, and so trying to adapt to a new culture and figure out what is like socially acceptable here and what is not to be shown, and kind of teetering the line of like, how Black can I be in these spaces, and then who do I share these things with? And then being a firstborn generation, I also had to like teeter on that line growing up, because there was this idea that, oh, you're Nigerian, but you're also American. Like there's like a mix, like where you belong, but no one's here to like kind of write that rule for me. And so I had to figure out like, when is it okay to be like this? When is it okay to be like that? And eventually discovering that through the many depths of me, that there's parts of me that I'm allowed to always show that are continuous. And so this project kind of reflects that. As an act of survival and grounding oneself while dealing with the loss and grievances and the rebirths of self, the imaginative playful lens of Afrofuturism and Indigenous realism creates room for discovery and allows us to unearth these mixed and alternative realities from the ground and ones from within ourselves. When we reflect on these experiences, we realize this is also an opportunity. Typically, when we think of the word junkie, it's akin to something such as trash, waste, and considered useless. And these junkie methods for years can be used as a way to heal systemic oppression, years of land and food insecurity, and a method to prevent the destruction of history and memories, and the method of urban community farmers that use these right now. During this discovery, I went back and forth and kind of looked at what was available to the local people of Oakland, and like kind of things that were relative to the site and things that were discarded and seen as junky. And with that, I started to create new junkie typologies, combining foreseen objects in unforeseeable ways, and mixing them. I created 6 junkie typologies, which then are embedded with different farming programs such as market, trade, ground supply, and service, and using that to create a collage that can further be used for different generations for people to come. So additionally, to like talk more about design process, animations was another way for me to think of storytelling and kind of like connecting the line between the thought process and how to actually embed these ideas onto the site. So again, healing is the backbone of the project, but the creation of junkie hybrids removed from healing is pointless. So to heal from land and self, we must integrate how healing is different for both subjects. There's healing for self and there's healing for land, and healing for land comprises of honoring, seeding, and feeding soil, whereas healing for self can comprise of harmonizing, balancing, and restoring one's body, mind, heart, and soul. With that, I've categorized the overlaps into different forms such as restoration, recovery, and rejoice in the forms of ritual. And again, healing is not linear or progressive, so that's why these blobs start to like move and change. And even through this continuous process of healing, there are moments of rest and reflection, and I wanted the site to start to mimic that. While weaving itself on the site, there's hugging, there's pooling, and there's moments of healing that allow the spine of healing to shift and break. It aims to progress forward, the spine then recollects itself, parting itself with past segments and capping off, allowing and creating different healing spine moments to ebb and flow, kind of like a beating heart on site. This is the kind of finalized iteration of the plan that I landed on for thesis, but throughout this process, I consider this just kind of like a stopping point in the timeline that this project can continue to change and transform. And in my junkie future, I focus on these 10 different junkie hybrids at the bottom of the screen because those felt relevant to me, and they had different operations such as like a native nursery for different plants, soil testing ground, outdoor markets, and trading posts, and composting networks and seeding exchange that kind of also help with this program idea of like storytelling and interaction with the community, things that I hold very near and dear to me. And in these sections, this kind of just goes through the site briefly and kind of shows how the junkie hybrids are then integrated with the healing spine. And then I'll focus on just like kind of one segment of the site. And so that breakdown of how the healing and land come together, this is an example of restoration. So healing for self can include eating and resting and connecting in spots like this, and healing for land includes composting, remediation, and using the inclusiveness of like cover crops. And in this detail section, it kind of shows the lighter brown is like the earth that was already there. And then the darker brown is to imply what happens over years when people continue to compost and remediate and to like fix and build upon this land. Okay, so restoration again is those combinations, but through this view, you can see that direct remediation allows for the preservation of native plants and the growth of crops to be shared by members of the community, and for things to be purchased from local stores to help sustain the well-being of Black and Brown people of Oakland. In this view, the idea of recovery combines balancing and seeding of land and self. And so there are moments where there's reflecting, meditating, touching the world around you like you did when you were younger, and a place to sit and gather and share stories and knowledge pertaining to seeds and saplings and how these stories kind of like travel through these objects that we carry and plant back into the earth. And through rejoice, there's the form of combining, harmonizing of self and honoring of land. So there's moments where in this image, you can see drumming and dancing and singing, and the idea that we can sit together and participate in planting and harvesting and celebratory traditions, as well as gathering and laughing and thanking the earth and our ancestors and descendants after us. And in this view, you can kind of imagine that after a long day of harvest, people come together, you can hear the clamoring of tools and the cadence with the drumming and laughter of children, and that the gathering is not too far from the market, which also encourages people to continue to trade and tell stories as they circulate and pass objects in the area. And then briefly, this construction GIF shows that building is also within the typologies and the material, and that can also be a form of resistance, referencing the construction and building techniques similar to the indigenous Willamette people of Oakland and African architecture. The construction of the spine starts with laying down the groundwork. Bamboo and wooden structures are grounded and connected by historical weaving and braiding techniques such as twining. While serving this purpose to connect the past and future through storytelling and resistance, the weaving and braiding patterns act as a structural membrane to support the onboarding of dirt. Dirt is stored and moved on site through this double layered and mesh casing, which allows for plants to blossom and bloom. And once these bags of dirt and seeds are like prepped with irrigation tubes sandwiched in between, additional dirt and compost added on top encourages future growth and development. The healing spine is now stable enough to support the addition of the junkie hybrids, and the underside of these healing spines create moments of wonder and playfulness through storytelling and nuanced signage. The colors of the woven structure act as signage for location of the junkie hybrids, and the patterns of the symbols embedded in the braid carry the language of the past and history for the future. Similar to the historical like traditional textiles and cloths, these colors have their own idiosyncratic meanings and representations of events and histories. They also provide structural rigidity, and the twining mechanism is also a weaving that is very important to many of these cultures, African and Indigenous alike, where it's a moment to sit around and gather and tell stories verbally while twining, but also a way to kind of have history embedded in a fabric. Lastly, through the accentuation of healing and farming, this project emphasizes the state of ground as an essential component for the longevity of the community and the earth. Therefore, the biodiversity of the soil coincides with the prosperity of marginalized communities of color. The soil composition must evolve for the community to evolve. Food and land are meant to be shared and treated with care and love. The opportunity to take care of a plant and to be taken care of is a blessing and should not be undermined. We must fight back against commodification and repurposing of land to protect this relationship. Our traditional ways of life have always been sustainable, and as a child of Nigerian immigrants who have lived through political unrest in their homeland, my depiction of a junkie just future is very different from this idea of what a sustainable or green future can be like. My junkie is different from everyone's junkie, of course, but a junkie future, I believe, reflects and honors the history of the land and its past and future users while resisting the capitalist regime and neoliberal paradigm, working in tandem, while people work in tandem to support each other. Seeded Junction is only just a seed in a larger network of projects. And in my junkie future, I see this project as a guide for food and land sovereignty. It can be reflected on many other sites with the same needs of deep healing. Together, I believe we can slowly but surely heal the land beneath us and wounds within us, as there are no individual answers for systemic issues. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much for all of the presentations. Thank you, Onyi, for closing out with a very provocative set of images as well. So now we are moving to a portion where our respondents, our invited respondents, might be able to speak to some of the things they have seen, heard, shared experience as personal shared experience. Anything else, Jeffrey?
I think especially, focusing on individual experiences, ways of architecture as a form of self-creating. I think that really was shown in many of the projects, that students expressed some frustration with their architectural education and excitement that they were able to express themselves and their own cultures in a way that, cultural backgrounds in a way that wasn't part of the curriculum. So I think that would be something to start on. I mean, there's a rich array of places to start, so I would be excited to hear what the 4 respondents think the best way to start is.
Let's jump in.
Yes, typically, if we weren't on Zoom, we would bring you up to the front of the room,
Right.
your glass of water,
Well, can I just
microphone.
say that this was so amazing? So it may take those of us who are responding a couple of minutes to
Of
just
course. Yeah.
sort our way through, because each and every presentation was just completely inspiring. And just to start off with a little bit of my limited experience with the School of Architecture is that I feel like these projects really kind of remind us of the degree to which architecture can be this embodied and engaged practice, and that that all these lived spaces go so far beyond buildings. They extend to social worlds and environments, geographies, culture, and it's just really, it's very refreshing for me to see all this all put together. So I don't mean to insult the School of Architecture when I say this. I'm just saying, like, I really appreciate the scope and the engagement of these projects.
I could jump in if that's okay. And I think I
course.
have the benefit of having seen the work in detail of many of the projects from last year's studio, but Ani as well, knowing your work from, and Jared knowing your work from the Weeksville project in Jared's case, and Oni, when we all as faculty, gathered to speak of like what was the most absolutely stunning project in research, in degree project. So even though we don't really know each other well, I'm really aware of that project and I've heard from your faculty. So if that's okay, like I actually was just trying to kind of scramble and write here in the background. So I think I just might try to read that. So I wanted to thank everyone, and I am truly honored to be here today and to be kind of asked to respond, and hope that I kind of am sensitive enough as an ally, and I am just so delighted to be here, and I am extraordinarily proud of all of you, if that matters at all. But I think that you do just remarkable work. So okay. So I wanted to start with our first presenter, Sydney, and that stated and framed, and it was stated and framed for our last of the afternoon, Ani's work. So Ani said that to, quote, understand, and I didn't get it exactly right, Sydney, so you may have to correct me, but to understand her home in coastal Virginia, that she needed to go outside to gain a knowledge of the inside. Like that just was, I got goosebumps again, even though you said it much better than I. And I thought like the idea, I'm going to ad lib a little bit here, but this idea of the coastal, of bringing us back into history, of these sites of atrocities, right? And then the sites of birth. And like, I loved when you said, like the oysters, and then your image showed, Black Americans shucking these oysters, which is an absolutely horrible job, right? But then saying, no, but in the culture and the food, shrimp and crabs and all of these things give that life force. So I just thought ecologically, I was I still like, I'm so moved by that, and all of the gorgeous projects. So I'm going to keep moving, because I thought like if we started with Sydney saying that, going out, I like go outside to get a knowledge of the inside. and then really question this ground plane. And then like while I was typing that up, on you were presenting, and like that kind of constantly moving junk plane, right? This idea of the surface of the earth, of this kind of rich area, made me think also of the rhizome, right? That kind of zone that's alive, that we may not necessarily see on its surface, but it's deep and it's profound and it's life-giving. I didn't write that part down, I'm just ad-libbing. But so Oni, you spoke about your Nigerian and American identities in a beautiful way. And I loved when you said, like, there's no one to write, how do you say it? To write the rules for you, like to understand these aspects of you, and that courage to do so, and to kind of really script, like self-identity. So that made me think, when I was going through the beautiful book that Jeffrey and Scott shared so generously with me last year, that arrived, you know, sort of still in the lockdown, was a way to open up, right, to go outside of that lockdown space. So Jeffrey, in his introduction, he states that this space is creative, like to think of, like, you know, what is Black space? It's like this is creative and aspirational. I thought that was really beautiful. So an interpretation of space that is fleeting, that is created, and also the introduction in the book, you know, really beautiful thinking of the kitchen and moving out, kind of pushing against. I'm just, for the moment, just blocking the author's, Tina Kempt, her piece. Right, yeah, so anyway, I thought that, like, idea of fleetingness, you know, a theme we heard so many times today. And so Jeffrey was speaking of the articulation through speech that is performed, this idea of the temporal, you know, thinking through Detroit and kind of raves and so forth that we were just hearing about. Then he spoke of and so it's temporal or entwined rhizomatically, as in Scott's notion in his piece, Rhizomatic Excerpts, as a way of, quote, tactically intertwining what it meets, forming new relationships and networks. So I just thought this invitation from Scott is in the realm of ideation and creative practice. Like, he really invites us to do so, and both like in their words and their book, and also in, obviously, in all of this extraordinary work in studio that you've done, and the seminars. So so if Jeffrey spoke of fleetingness of speech subject to erasure, I saw there was an articulation, and I loved the way Scott said that that the contours, quote, the quote, contours linger in memory. So just, if I've skipped a little bit, I was just trying to finish this so I would have something to say at the end. But I would say that speaking through CJ and Sierra's forwarding of the collage in their project, they, you know, we also saw that in Barron and Cameron, and also Oni stated this at the end, that collaging rather than render holds the fleetingness of time. So I was finding these kind of looping back through, and all of the kind of collage work as in a sense a practice that would be like not tying down, but opening up all possibility, right? So even thinking of, you know, the maps of Minneapolis, right? So collaging rather than rendering holds the fleetingness of time. And Jared stating with real engagement with Weeksville. And then I thought this was something, like, all of you as young professionals in the field, that's something that unites all of us, is like going back into Texas in that mad period where Texas is not part of the US grid, right? And this, you know, the difference in those who had heat or didn't, who had power and didn't, but then using like all of those tools of GIS, all of those tools to understand and map in real time, handing out water, where these resources was, I thought was really, really, you know, where I see like that full engagement. And I thought that that way of working with mapping was absolutely, totally, truly a way to decolonize the idea that we started at the beginning looking at maps as a kind of a colonizing force. So I'm almost done. So I see that these utterances and, you know, a lot of references to Afrofuturisms, the work and explorations are extraordinary. They're networking, pulling us into this act of self-creating, and I'm honored to have been entwined and visiting your work again. So you all challenge the curriculum, and you are the future. So thank you.
Masterfully done.
Thank you.
And very, very intricate, actually, in a short period of time.
Thank you. Yes. I've been entwined on and off over the year with everybody, so I think about the projects. I still talk about the projects a lot, actually. So.
Yes.
Maybe I can pick up on some of Alicia's really wonderful and incredibly composed comments. It's my first year at the school, and I'm encountering these for the first time. But I'm so impressed with the level of depth of thought and the kind of correlation with strikingly beautiful imagery. And the aspect of this that I really wanted to hook into, and I'll see if I can sort of connect through this to a few of the concepts that I found just incredibly compelling here, is the framing of all of these projects in terms of this, the phrase "in search of," which I find that incredibly profound. And each of you spoke about this in your own way as a kind of continuing and continual process. In other words, none of these are solutions; they're all methods. Which I find that to be such a powerful notion, that you're not showing us ways of solving problems, you're showing us ways of solving problems. And so where I want to take this is, first of all, to think through what I think in each one of these projects is an invitation to revalue our values, or several of you talked about the reinvestment of meaning, whether that's in mapping and thinking about mapping as a kind of anti-colonial practice, or even I think CJ and Jared just put in the chat, hijacking, right? Hijacking, right? Like reappropriation of these methods. I just find that incredible. And so this idea of removal of the potential for easy commodification, right? For exchange. Several of you talked about notions of group economics, or ways of redefining the ground. And I found myself returning a few times to a few references beyond, you know, or in the realm, we could say, of Afrofuturism. Things like Wangechi Mutu, the artist who makes incredible collages using the ground. Or we could say in the very last presentation that Oni showed us of rethinking along the lines, I imagine, of Catherine Yusuf's Billion Black Anthropocenes or None, the notion of remaking the ground from the ground up, we could say, but also from the ground downward. And along these same lines, the idea of reinvesting, you know, what we would typically think of as junk with a different mode of valuation, which I think is also related to the scholar Lisa Oden, who has done work on the sculptor Noah Purefoy, rethinking junk as something that might itself have value. And, you know, again, counterposing that to this very familiar architectural, you know, trope of junk space, right? To rethink what we would typically describe under those sorts of rubrics. And so if I can just sort of, the one other sort of element here that I thought was persistent across several of these that I thought was wonderful was this idea of retelling history through autobiography, this notion of a kind of auto history, which is to say history itself is something that is to some degree formalized, if not necessarily a colonial practice. And so, you know, ways of rethinking those methods through oneself, and then also through the kind of rhizomatic structure of the various selves and the collective self. I just think these are incredibly inspiring ways of approaching architectural practice and telling stories through architecture. So thank you so much for allowing me to participate. This has been such a pleasure so far, and I'll let other people jump in.
Should I jump, Caitlin?
Please.
Yeah.
Or do you?
Jump.
Okay, well, I think I'm just gonna talk about some themes that run through these, each incredible, but I'm not sure I have the capacity, since I don't know most of you, to kind of connect each of your individual projects together. But I guess as a historian, and that was certainly my contribution to, I think, to the book that Jeffrey and Scott so beautifully put together and edited, is this notion of like that history is really this located thing. Like, it's not something out there. And I feel like all the projects really grasped that. And I just really appreciated the sort of, like, I think it was Sydney's reference to Hampton, is that right? And Hampton Roads, and that being such a kind of a central feature of Black history. You know, and the way that she laid out that those different moments, the way that those different bodies of water connect there. And also I was just thinking that flows into a kind of a knowledge that's also transmitted through storytelling, or a history that's really travels through storytelling. I feel like a lot of getting at this, even though a lot of this project was getting at identity, it was also very much producing these new forms of knowledge that are kind of desperately needed. And I think those new forms of knowledge really rely, in all your cases, on a kind of a depth of historical awareness and an experience. I think that that really challenges the dominant historical narratives that we all have to contend with. So I really appreciated that. I also appreciated the way the projects don't really back away from the discomfort of challenging normative power. Like, I think this work has to be uncomfortable. And I feel like none of these projects backed away from that all of you kind of embrace the, you know, the different tensions that wove through your stories, so that, you know, farming, agriculture is very connected to enslavement. On the other hand, Black farming has been this really important way of holding land and holding place for people. And Black farming ways since almost immediately after the Civil Wars, this also has this trajectory of theft, of white theft of Black land. And so I think reconstituting land as something that can be appropriated for these alternative visions is really fantastic. I think I'll just say one more thing, which is a lot of my work is on Black cities. And when I talk about that, I think I usually mean majority Black cities, like in the case of Detroit. But I think what I really saw in your projects that's kind of a takeaway for me is the way that Black cities don't have to be majority Black cities, right? That there are all these kind of cultural pockets that work together within a city and create, you know, Black culture, Black politics of resistance that produce Black knowledges that are often not seen and acknowledged in the way that they need to be to move towards the kind of transformational change that I think all your projects are calling for. So I think just thinking of that, like city rural connection, the care connection that ran through all of these, and the sense of reclaiming and restoration. That's really very much about reclaiming a future that is always on the point of being, you know, kind of taken away or circumscribed. Certainly in the United States with the, you know, the structures of power that are all around us and in us. So I'll just stop there. But I would say that it was a great pleasure to hear all these presentations, and I walk away from my week doubly reinvigorated. So thank you.
Hey, everybody. I feel just blown away. You know, it was kind of like presentation after presentation. And I know many of you who are presenting and feel just really honored to get to share space with you in this way and to see your work. It's just feels really profound. And I was thinking about this quote. Today there was a teaching on bell hooks, right? Who, you know, one of our ancestors who passed away, and thinking about this quote from her, which is as a radical standpoint, perspective, position, the politics of location necessarily calls those of us who would participate in the formation of counter-hegemonic cultural practice to identify the spaces where we begin the process of revision. And I guess I was thinking about like the politics of location of this teaching, of like Pratt, right? Of like the ways in which your work and the kind of labor that you all have been doing to kind of push open and create these emancipatory spaces at Pratt, right? And in the School of Architecture, right? And within the labor that you do with, which is like this labor care, like these kinds of, I was thinking about when Jared was talking about in Houston, right? The like water bottles, right? But like how NOMAS is like this community care network, right? And I'm thinking about like also the politics of location here in New York City, where architecture is weaponized against Black and Brown communities, right? And you are kind of opening up these different ways of thinking about how architecture can be ways, and design processes and creative work can be places of healing and reclaiming, right? And of a dialogue, and really the kind of personal work that you all are doing, kind of in dialoguing with your families and your families' histories, and kind of tracing that through line. And that feels like really profound work that that you're disalienating, right, as a like kind of practice and pedagogy of like thinking about how can we teach and learn and do differently, of how do we kind of reinsert and reclaim. Catherine McKittrick talks about this idea of a Black sense of naming a Black sense of place to expand, right? And rather than narrow the concept of place, and how can we kind of think about that imagination and insistence of a Black sense of place as a abolition geography, and as this idea of thinking about opening up, how can things be differently? And I love the time traveling kind of across, and I feel like there's like comments on each of your presentations, but like really thinking about this as this opportunity, like through a kind of across the ways in which you're thinking about design as ways of, and I would love to hear from you all, how design can be an opportunity to potentially heal place-based harms. So kind of holding that, and Bell Hooks writes about this idea of our struggle is also a struggle of memory against forgetting, right? And then also the healing that was, I feel like, really central to Ani's work, but that in terms of, Ani, the way that you were naming and framing your work, but that I felt like was really present in everyone's work, in terms of thinking about how do we dismantle and disrupt, right? And center body, lived experience, situated knowledge. And I think about, like, from the Paulo Freire idea, of that idea of kind of moving from the personal to social theorizing as a way of like kind of rethinking how do we respond to structural violence, of how to of this kind of way of producing knowledge that's relational and really communal, the communal care, whether it's like the kinds of ways in which Sydney brought us into conversation with both violence and also thinking about relationship to the land, right, as this kind of healing practice. And I'm thinking about then how Cameron, I have just so many notes. It was super overwhelming I'm just like in my own body trying to take breaths right in between, and I can't even really read my notes. But like thinking about also then Cameron, like, oh, so beautiful, like the ways in which you're talking about your inquiry with your father, right? That kind of relational practice of thinking about your own personal exploration of history as really understanding also the present and future. So powerful, that kind of time traveling. And I'm thinking about, yeah, Jared, I felt like thinking about the Black Futures projects as this kind of communal care network of mutual aid, and like what is mutual aid, right? Like the hijacking that you put in the chat of that way of like how through identifying what's the ways in which the state has abandoned, right? We then develop this kind of political analysis. And I feel like just knowing many of you, like through classes, you're like, oh, this is missing in my education. And I felt like, Joshua, you were talking about that so powerfully, right? Like the Farnsworth House, like I want that as a poster, you know, like that's just so powerful, right? And then, yeah, like Barron and Cameron, like the peopling, the like thinking about how like Ebbetsfield, Root Shock, medieval of like the reclaiming and thinking about kind of connecting with the land. It was so profound and beautiful. And that kind of like really thinking about life affirming representations of community, which also felt really present in Sierra and CJ's work of really that kind of affirmation as a way of and thinking about representations and about dismantling the carceral system, right? And again, like thinking about like what are our roles as designers and architects and scholars in this work of thinking about abolition placemaking. So that was so powerful. Oh, Joshua, like I've never heard you speak, but I saw your project. I think it won an award, a social justice award a few years ago. And so it's just like so amazing to hear you speak about it and the conjuring. And I feel like that's what you all are doing, right? You're like conjuring up, you're kind of like that, those like whooshing like energy. I feel like that's the way I feel that you know, this kind of collective, again, moving from that personal to collective, the bones, the and that the power of that I just, my notes are so like, they're so, I can't even read them, but yeah, and that the bones as a way of kind of like taking over, right, and reclaiming and insisting, right, on that idea McKittrick talks about, that paradoxical space, that centering within. And then Ani, like I felt like your presentation was healing, you know, and like the animations, I've never seen that part of your work before. I've seen parts of your final project, but like, and that I feel like it's so weird in a way, like it's so embodied, and here we are on Zoom, and I want to like be in that space together at the end, and because I just feel like yeah, and think like there's just so many layers of it, right? But I guess I want to kind of like think about for for you all, like really it's like a question of what kinds of supports do you need, right, to do this work, right? And how can we kind of like push out on this in this kind of counter hegemonic space that you're creating to like expand, right? And thinking again about Black sense of space as expansive. So anyways, thank you. Felt like such an honor, and yeah, beautiful work.
Thank you for that segue. to, opening the floor for discussion and possibly more so a question that you put forward from respondents in a way, but more so, what is this teaching about? Why is it that it's organized and not Jeffrey or myself presenting a paper, but saying, no, present the people who the paper is about in a way. Let you as students speak for yourselves. And, that last question that Caitlin has put forward, what are things that you feel work, don't work, that you might need currently and in the future, as a place to now start a discussion amongst the entire group of people who are here. Anyone want to take that on?
Yes, and just one thought before that is Caitlin's point or question of what do you need for us to support you moving ahead in this? I'm old enough to be reading the obituaries of most of my faculty from UC Berkeley. And I remember Norma Evanson, who died recently. I corresponded with her for years. And she was so generous and got me all sorts of things that I never would have gotten if I hadn't corresponded with her. And at first I felt really awkward, writing to her. Back then you wrote a letter and they wrote back, it wasn't an email. And but I do want to encourage all of you to continue to communicate with us, because this is so exciting for me personally to see all this work come together after 20 years here at Pratt. And I just want to emphasize, what do you need for us to support you? And one more appeal for graduate school. It will really make a difference for many of you moving ahead. And there is funding. We'll make sure you get fully funded. If that's
whoa, make sure. Whoa.
Well,
no contracts here.
We're not providing the funding, but we'll help you to secure it in the ways that you need it.
The floor is the audience.
Yes.
And students.
I'll probably just be listening in a second because I do have to go back to work. But I think as far as the teachers who are here already have provided a space for us to express ourselves, which was able to get us to the endpoint that we were. Is more so, how can we afford it for other teachers, it seems? Because if you notice, it's when we're in certain environments that y'all have provided that allowed us to kind of explore this type of vulnerable work in itself and kind of really express ourselves unapologetically. Really, I don't know if it's what y'all can provide. We know y'all will provide for us if we reach out. It's more so how to not outreach. I don't know how to explain it, but it's kind of the same as code switching. It's around certain people you feel, there's a layer of vulnerability with certain people you feel that allows you to express yourself. And I do think Pratt has like a long way in going to do that. As far as teachers, especially as far as education, as far as our relationship to teaching. And in Caitlin's class recently, we did a readings about teaching, and we were talking about, by bell hooks, teaching transgression. And I really took away from that and didn't realize in our class discussion when looking back on my own education, that's when I thrived the most. Kind of course, people who look like me, of course, but because people who understand a certain type of community and certain type of praxis that kind of aided in that type of healing and like connection. School is an institution in the end, but definitely the people, how they begin to interpret that institution really contributes to how we feel.
I'll probably just add a little bit in, but I love seeing all these projects. They're all amazing, and like Sid said, they came from being in that comfortable space, which is why the thing I hate is that it's all 4th and 5th year. I hate that we had to wait this long to do this, that we had to wait this long to be able, be comfortable enough. I know I tried, and I'm sure a few other students tried to bring ideas like this forward, and were very squashed, for lack of a better term that I can think right now. So with Stephen Slater coming, I'm very excited to see, hopefully we can see some changes there. But that's the biggest thing, if there's something to like be done for that I can think of, is to get stuff like this earlier. You know, first year working on, and like Sierra and I were working on something in Halen's class about like first year, how can we have oral histories, and how can we bring, like, you have to actually have some participatory efforts in your design, so that, you know, our foundation is of participatory design. Our foundation is of learning about communities, of reaching back into our own histories. Everyone has their own history, you know. How can we reach back into our own histories and let that inform, rather than, I don't know, whatever we do. So yeah, that's the only thing I would say.
Yeah, I guess in addition to what Jared and Sydney have said so far, like so many faces in this room I know, but it's because like professors have provided the environment for me to like feel comfortable connecting and interacting. Like I would have never had like a deep connection with many of the fifth years here right now if it wasn't for Scott saying like, oh, we should start a NOMAS chapter. And like that helped me like get to know everyone in this space, and like learn about other classes that other people were taking, other artists and architects that were interested in having that community. Like I missed that opportunity to like get to know Josh personally. I watched your thesis project on Zoom during the pandemic, and I was like, I missed out on an opportunity. But like it's really nice to have this now. But of course, like I feel like the discourse and these conversations that we're like aching for don't really come until fifth or fourth year, because the professors aren't not ready to like handle that type of conversation room, because there's such a focus on like point, line, plane, surface, and like the breakdown of architecture. But I feel like that's where many of us start to question, even if we want to continue in our architecture degree, because it's so far from what we thought it was going to be, and the precedents that we're like told to learn and understand are so, we can't relate to them. They don't make sense to us, and it's just like rote history that has to like, we have to learn it to pass a class. And there's not many examples of like Black architects or Indigenous architects or Asian Latinx architects that we get to see like in those early years of our architectural history. And so it's just really like disheartening sometimes that like you don't have these spaces until you get like past all of like the things that happen in third year. But maybe if there's a way to, I don't know, like first year have like Jared's talking, like a participatory class where there's a project that gets to be more of like architects as like acting as a server to like transform and like understand like what people need in these spaces, like co-designing things and acting as a facilitator rather than like the person who's in charge. Like there's too many times where like we're placed to be the steers of the wheel and we don't know what we're doing, and people tell us like, oh, you can't build like that, or like that's not like architectural lingo, and like saying like there's so many, I guess, like yes and no's that we're like hard rules that we're told like first year and second year. So it like becomes hard to break that mold for some people. And so like having, I guess, like a redesign on pedagogy for incoming first years would be where we start, to be honest.
Thank you for that. We did ask all of the 4 chair candidates this year how they would decolonize the core. And that was a direct question that we asked all of them. I won't tell you their responses, but I will tell you that it was on the table. And it's something that I've mentioned to Harriet and Killian a number of times. So it is definitely something, I hear what you're saying. It does seem like a really important thing to address in the school. Given your experiences, and that your examples of students who survived the core, and there are many who don't, we have a fourth year now with very few students of color in it because of that. They're not here. So I think that's a really good point, but thank you for making that so strongly.
I mean, and actually we have some comments here in the chat that
Please,
would you
yes.
like to, Pierre, you placed some in the chat that like to enter into the discussion?
Oh, sure. I mean, I'm just going to restate what I've put, but I think that it's a fun time and a good time to brainstorm around this idea of, well, what could happen in the first year? And without a doubt, I think the problem with first year is that pedagogically, it's always, and for 100 million years, been thought about as indoctrination. I mean, when I was in first year, that was what it was in grad school. And there just has to be a pushback. And so the question is, where do we push? Where do we push? Who do we push? So there's an opportunity. There's a new chair coming in. I want to say too that I remember when I started teaching in the program, Jeffrey, that there was a lot of stuff on your syllabus and that you were doing in the HMS classes that really were cracking, cracking holes into what we see as the status quo and sort of letting some of these opportunities seep in. But anyway, I think pedagogically there's space to think about an overlap of different disciplines in shorter term projects. Like if you had a 3-week participatory design project that was based around excavating a certain history and then responding to it and then designing for it and allowing a discussion that's both, abstract and concrete at the same time. There's an overemphasis on the abstract in the first year, as if that can exist separate from who we are as like living human beings, right? Like you're eating pizza and drawing a line at the same time. That's the reality. So let's talk about who makes the pizza, where the pizza comes from, why it tastes good, why it doesn't taste good. So I'm kind of restating the thoughts in the chat, but I think we have an opportunity to push because there's going to be a new chair.
Right. And actually, in some ways, not to put a lot of pressure on the new chair, but also to put a lot of pressure on the new chair. That moments like this, hopefully we can make sure that they're able to see a collected presentation of projects that are scattered across classes, across years, things of that nature. And so we just placed a few of them together now, to kind of give a sense of like, okay, well, this can happen. And as we said, it's 4th and 5th year right now. As a core curriculum instructor, it hurts my heart to hear some of the things that you've just said about the core, and especially a statement here Jared wrote in chat that he asked and interviewed some professors and students alike in first year, what are you getting out of this? And the response was, pretty much nothing or useless. And again, that's something that hopefully we can have better professors for lack of ones who can address that question and not come back with useless. For as much as I think the pedagogy that Jeffrey and I are discussing, we're engaged in decolonization, but not destruction of everything, right? There are good aspects that again are when not tainted or when used, similar to as we're looking at, farming in one way is good things for human beings. It's about sustenance. That's what farming is. But historically it was used for enslavement, and it was desecrated in some ways. But to then retake and reclaim which is our human right to farm, agriculture, to be one with the earth. Similar thing with I would hope would be curricular aspects to engage and to extract those things which are whole and real, and be able to not continue the poor presentation of that work, and also the kind of malintent of that work, which is to indoctrinate, right? I would agree, you know, break and indoctrinate is kind of the first year curriculum. You know, forget everything you've done, everything you've known and experienced, and now relearn, you know, through our new terms. I'm talking too much. And,
It's good. I mean, I was going to jump in, you know, just like back to Ani's, like, you know, point lines and planes and all that kind of just drilling and all of, you know, this kind of indoctrination and getting the language down. And I do think that there's a pushback, and we've been trying to work through the first year history curriculum for a while. But I know that the linking in with, you know, Lit Crit and HMS courses, I mean, I see that coming into my papers, and this is making me think very much about even the first exercise that we do in the fall, that I love this idea that, you know, that it can be more of an oral history. We actually asked the students to do something. I think most of you, I started teaching that 4 years ago, so I didn't have any of you in that kind of first year core. But I know that we're trying to have this first project, you know, be much more like find a building or find a place that's of interest to you, where you're from, and kind of bringing those stories. And I think that we could really highlight that more, and then working as Pierre was, and also Jeffrey, like how we can tie back in, you know, to the Pierre speaking about Jeffrey and the kind of the richness of the curricula. Maybe there's ways to pull that back in. So that was one thought. And just like, I don't want to dominate either because I spoke a lot earlier, but then we know that like there's history theory, and Catherine Chattergoon and I've talked about this a lot, you know, that somehow there's all of this stuff in the first 2 years, and then all of a sudden there's nothing until you kind of get into preparing for degree project, right? So there's like these 2 years that are just like, now we're going to be architects and do these projects. So I you know, I'm in the chair's office as, you know, in an acting position, but you know, I'm acting assistant chair through June, maybe staying on, we'll see. You know, I'd like to, but you know, I think that these conversations, especially with Stephen coming in, and Stephen's already been involved in some of the conversations at the beginning of the pandemic, right? In kind of the reading lists and really thinking of how to decolonize a curriculum. So I think we're ripe to do that. I think it's time to do it. And you know, anyway, so if that's yeah, and just something like in the curriculum, there's no room, right? You have steel, concrete, like all this stuff you have to do years like 3, 4, that it's tough that we don't have those conversations again until you're in degree project. That sounds like really the nuts and bolts of things, but I think the nuts and bolts, you know, have to be addressed with something that's kind of much more profound. And I like just some of the faculty, I'm thinking, you know, if we, you know, maybe try to do some kind of retreat. I know that we try to speak across the different sections, but it's always left to be something kind of, you know, maybe there's ways to do something like this just in terms of curricular work, and including, you know, student and alum stewards, you know, coming in to advise. It's a thought.
Yes, I'm just really excited that, thank you for those comments. And I'm just really excited that at the end of these masterful presentations, I mean, together it was so, you're from different classes, so I've never experienced this quite like this, that all of you are interested in your own education and revising your own education for the future, you know, in a way that would be more beneficial to people coming into the school. Now, I think that's a wonderful way to end this with a discussion of education and how you're educated. And as Alicia was saying just now, it sounds like this is something that's to come. It's ongoing, and we'll be dipping into this for sure in the future.